Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 3, Objectives and Determinants. And our topic is Determinants of India's Foreign Policy. And the determinant is economic conditions. The possession of raw materials and natural resources and the compulsions of economic development also determine the course of a country's foreign policy. Low economic profile could impinge on a country's ability to play an influential and effective role in foreign affairs. India is a storehouse of vast natural resources with great potential for achieving economic heights in development. Its rivers are capable of generating power and providing enough water for drinking and irrigation. Huge deposits of bauxite, coal, copper, manganese, and other minerals are India's assets. Equally notable is the base of its skilled and educated workforce. Despite progress made in the fields of agriculture, literacy, science, and technology, there is no denying that India lags far behind in development. The bulk of its growing population finds it difficult to cater to basic necessities like food, shelter, and clothing. After independence, it was clear to our leaders that the country needs help from foreign governments in respect of transfer of funds, import of equipment and finished goods, export of Indian commodities and goods, training of technical personnel, etc. In an ideologically polarized world, India needed friendship and goodwill from both the free market economies in the West as well as the socialist world led by the former Soviet Union. By adopting the policy of non alignment, India hoped for assistance from both the camps. As a parallel to that external policy, India had adopted a mixed economy approach that combined public sector with heavy state investment in infrastructure areas, while a strong private sector flourished in an array of other areas. India's economic linkages with the erstwhile colonial ruler, the United Kingdom, guided Nehru forge friendly contact with that country, both bilaterally and within the Commonwealth grouping. Vast portion of India's trade involving export of raw materials like cotton, tea, and import of heavy machinery and technology has been with the United States and West European countries. These countries have come forward with generous grant and loans for various projects, apart from facilitating multilateral funding through the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The former Soviet Union too emerged as a key partner in defense and other aspects of foreign trade on favorable terms. Also, notably heavy dependence on oil for industrial and economic needs has brought special focus on relations with oil rich Arab countries in West Asia, apart from working for stable supplies and prices of oil in global market. At a different level, the economic conditions of country provide inputs to India's foreign policy to argue for easing of economic disparities between the developed and the less developed countries and for greater economic relationships among the developing countries themselves. Now, the next topic is nature of leadership. The personal equality of leaders guiding the destiny of a nation at a given time tend to shape that country's foreign policy in a particular direction. Who can deny the role of, for instance, Woodrow Wilson in shaping the foreign policy of United States in the early decades of the 20th century, or that of Mikhail Gorbachev in making the Soviet policy in closing years of the same century. Similarly, in the case of India too, the personality of the incumbent prime ministers has come to be identified in certain measure with a particular flavor given to country's foreign policy. The country's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, who steered India's policy for more than 1.5 decades, was widely regarded as internationalist in outlook, with a preference for enlightened rather than narrow or self-centered approach to problems. He was indeed regarded as among the tallest of visionaries in his time. Understandably, therefore, India's foreign policy during his tenure was more committed to the collective good of the Committee of Nations in relation to concerns like world peace and disarmament. Panchil was a typical representation of the Nehruvian outlook to approaching problems with other countries. Quite contrasting is the case of the influence of his daughter Indira Gandhi. By nature, she came out as a strong and decisive personality. Her proclivity to be pragmatic and sensitivity to the imperatives of vital national interest left an imprint on reorienting the foreign policy along the line of realism more than idealism. This is how India's foreign policy with reference to the liberation of Bangladesh, non-accession to non-proliferation treaty, and strengthening of ties with the former Soviet Union may be viewed. Again, the reputed qualities as a moderate of Atal Bihari Vajpayee was, are said to have influenced the policy of engagement with Pakistan and the United States. The next point is domestic milieu. No country's foreign policy can be immune from the influence of the dynamic within. Indeed, it is an important determinant of foreign policy. The domestic milieu refers to, inter alia, the nature of governing system, the political culture, including the policies of political parties, public opinion, etc., tradition, structure of government, and enlightened leadership. Independent India is a living example of unity in diversity, how having won freedom from British after non-violent struggle. India choose to democratic system that could offer adequate representation to diversities of all kinds, regional, religious, and cultural. The executive is accountable to people's representatives who are chosen in periodical exercise of franchise. India's political system was based on Westminster model of parliamentary democracy. However much the executive would like to view foreign policy as its prerogative, parliamentary control over the executive has opened channels for influencing the country's foreign policy. In general, fortunately, India's foreign policy reflected the national consensus cutting across the political differences between the ruling side and the opposition. Non alignment policy is a clear example here. This, however, is not to say that the parliament and prime minister always looked eye to eye on all foreign policy issues all the time. Even during the time of Nehru, who had exercised more discretion than any other prime minister, parliament sought to assert itself in respect of his policy vis-a-vis the boundary dispute with China and the Goa question in the late 1950s. Recently, in 2003, again, India's approach to the Iraq problem was very much dictated by the sentiments articulated in Parliament, in as much the government agreed to become party in deploring the American military action against Iraq. The political parties too at the time of election take positions on foreign policy matters in their respective manifestos. There are varied views expressed by the BJP at one end and the Communist Party at the other concerning globalization, World Trade Organization, and several other issues. Similarly, some of the regional parties like those in Tamil Nadu DMK, Anna DMK, MDMK, etc., and Jammu Kashmir, the National Conference, for instance, have come to determine the country's policy towards Sri Lanka and Pakistan, respectively. Public opinion ventilated through media and other channels and the activities of interest pressure groups like the Friendship Society and the business associations have gained importance as determinant of India's foreign policy. The role of ISCUS or of CIA cannot be denied. For example, in the context of relations with the Soviet Union and the United States, respectively. The print and lately the visual media have been influential determinants of the policy. The two most notable examples of the role played by the television and print media in making India respond the way it did related to the hijacking of Indian Airlines plane to Kandahar in 1999 and the official announcement of decision not to accede to the United States request for sending troops to post-war Iraq. Next point is international trends. The broad currents of international politics at any given point of time have direct bearing on foreign policies. The difficulty in conducting the foreign policy arises because states do not have sure means of controlling the behavior of other states. During the interwar period, the quest for French security, followed by the rise of fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany and militarism in Japan, had their impact on foreign policies. The US changed its policy towards the Soviet Union and recognized it because in 1933 Hitler's emergence in Germany posed a threat to the world order created after the war. The Japanese aggression in Manchuria in 1931 provided a common threat to USA as well as USSR in the Far East. The two powers gave up their hostility. The Cold War era has determined in a big way the foreign policy of most countries. The fear of nuclearized United States brought the countries of Eastern Europe under the control of the Soviet Union, with the result that all those countries adopted socialism and came under the Russian wings. The entire policy of containment of communalism adopted by the US was evident in its setting up of NATO, SEATO, and such other military alliances or arrangements. India's efforts in expounding the policy of non alignment was directly a response to this emerging polarization in the international environment. The Cold War was the defining characteristic of world politics for nearly 45 years. Arms race, especially in the nuclear field, typically represented the height of suspicious and the impending disaster. India's policy to take up nuclear disarmament emanated from the imminent and perpetual threat to human civilization if those weapons were to be accidentally or deliberately used. Related to nuclear field, India's successful testing in 1998 of nuclear weapons was justified as a necessary response to the fast changing international environment that sought to dismiss the demand for nuclear disarmament and sanctify the inequitable hierarchy between the nuclear weapon powers and non nuclear weapon powers. After the sudden end of the Cold War, followed by the disintegration of the Soviet Union, India's foreign policy underwent appreciable shift on numerous counts. Lack of enthusiasm towards the non aligned movement, eagerness to accommodate the American concerns, resumption of full diplomatic ties with Israel, emphasis on economic aspects of relations with Europe, Southeast Asia, and even South Asia. Again, in the post Cold War era, the increasing sensitivity in international quarters to the issues of terrorism and human rights, along with the widely spread claims of self determination, impelled necessary adjustments in India's foreign policy. During the 1990s, the critical observers of India's foreign policy have noted the government's preoccupation with the question of Jammu and Kashmir in its contacts with major countries in global forums. The 11 September 2001 terrorist attacks on American targets in New York and Washington presented new opportunities to India to push its anti-terrorist foreign policy with greater conviction. Now let us look at the summary of the unit. The multifarious objectives of India's foreign policy achieve a blend of national and international interest. India has sought to achieve its security and socio-economic advancement while at the same time working for peace, freedom, progress, and justice to all nations and peoples. Non-alignment, adherence to peaceful procedures for settlement of differences, support to the initiatives for disarmament, and active participation in international bodies constituted notable principles that flow from the objectives of the country's foreign policy. As elaborated among several determinants of foreign policy, the relevance of factors like India's geographical size, location, its historical experiences and traditions, the state of economy, the nature of political institutions and structure, and the personality of the country's leadership have played a significant role in shaping the country's policy with countries in its neighborhood and outside. Moreover, the impact of the changing international environment, be it the Cold War politics or the post Cold War trends, too, is something not to be missed while understanding shift in our foreign policy. All in all, India seems to have done pretty well in formulating and implementing a foreign policy behind which the nation stood united and which projected the country as a peace loving, mature, democratic, and law abiding country in the realms of world affairs. Now we want to wind up this lecture and we have come to the end of the unit. Thank you so much for your attention.